Welcome to the Faith Science Podcast, episode 11. I'm your host, Jerry Swafford, and on this podcast, we explore the integration of science with faith. Today is a solo podcast. This is the first one of this kind. I originally started this podcast thinking that every single episode would be an interview with someone else because I didn't want to hear myself talk or anything like that, and I still don't. But today's podcast will be a solo one. I will be talking about the future of this podcast and some of the things I'm wanting to do with it. Now that I have 10 full episodes under my belt, I'm looking to maybe pivot a little bit and really focus in more on a certain aspect of the podcast. And in the second part, where I would usually be asking the guest what it is that they are excited about, I'm going to be talking about my new book and giving a summary of it and telling you how you can get it. The third aspect of third part of the podcast, I actually ask some questions about. I usually have the final four questions that I ask the guest and today I will be the guest. I will be answering those questions instead of asking them to someone else. And so there's no way for you to know this without me saying it, but I will say it. I just recorded an hour and 11-minute podcast solo and then got to the end of the podcast and my microphone was not on the entire time. So I'm shooting this for the second time, which is a good thing, I think, because I have a better understanding of what I'll do. There were some places in the podcast in that episode that a lot of dead spaces, and I didn't have everything together. I forgot one of the final four questions and had to find it. And so I think this is going to be much smoother for you. So hopefully this is better content for you. So, what I'm going to be starting with is a description of the podcast so far, what I meant to set out to do, and what I'm currently doing moving forward. Then I'm actually going to answer a couple of YouTube comments on some of my videos to give you a sense of why it is I think I'm going into a slightly different direction. And then I'll go into the final four, and then I'll talk about my book and then go into the final four questions. So that's how the podcast is going to be laid out today. So if you absolutely hate this, please let me know. If you know me personally, text me or talk to me about it, and I'll make sure we won't do any more solos. Okay. So it's called the Faith Science Podcast, of course. And what I was setting out to do is to have a podcast what I say is it explores the integration of science with faith. I also like to, when I'm telling people about the podcast, I say that I have interviews or discussions that are at the intersection of science with faith. Now, my contention is that our faith should intersect all of life. And so it's not this compartment that we have over to the side, or it's not a seasoning that we sprinkle on top of the other aspects of our life, but instead it is a foundational aspect to our life that everything touches our faith. And so that's the way I believe we should think about everything. And so part of this podcast is about showing people that and modeling that. And so especially in the area of science, where there are so often people that are telling us that we should not and must not mix science with faith. Now, the ironic thing about this is that modern science originated from people who were believers, who believed in God. Faith in God was foundational in their lives. And so they looked out at the universe, they looked out into the world and said, I want to know more about this world that God has made. So that's where science came from, is that it came from a foundation of faith. And that's what we're trying to bring back or get back to on this podcast. Now, the reason why I've talked about potentially pivoting is that if you look at the guests that I've had on the first 10 episodes of my podcast, I've had several different types of people. I've had some educational professionals. I've had a counselor. I've had a habits coach, a coach for dads, basically the leadership dad from last week, and there have been various types of people on. I had someone that talked about purpose. And so if you looked at 8 out of those 10 episodes, they were with people talking about things like purpose and counseling and education and leadership, habit formation, and those kinds of ideas. But there are 2 of those episodes out of the first 10 that were more along the lines of what we would call apologetics, thinking about the existence of God, the reliability or inspiration of the Bible, and those kinds of topics. And those were the podcast episodes with Dr. Bo Kirkwood. That episode, I believe, was called Evolution is Not Scientific at All. And then the other episode was with Dr. Don DeYoung about 2 weeks ago. And that episode was that the earth is thousands, not billions of years old. Now, those two episodes were quite a bit different than some of the other ones, and there was quite a bit of response that I received to them. And what I would say is much of that response was not very positive. And so, if you don't follow this on YouTube, you might be unaware of the comments that have been placed on some of the videos and the content related to those two episodes. But those episodes were other than my very first episode, where I basically said to my Facebook friends and people on LinkedIn that I had a new podcast, that is the most watched YouTube video. But if you combine the YouTube watches with the YouTube podcast watches, the episode with Dr. Bo from a few weeks ago is the most watched episode. And then the episode with Dr. Don was a higher than usual in number of views. And so that got me to thinking that all of this engagement that has happened with this particular apologetics based content might give me an opportunity to say, let me lean more heavily into that direction. And I believe that is going to be the decision I'm going to make. I am not 100% there yet, but my intention right now is to go in that direction, make that final decision. And what you will now see moving forward is that probably instead of it being 20% as it's been in the first 10 episodes, it will become closer to 80% or 90% of my future episodes. I'm intending over the next few months, 80% or so of those episodes will be apologetics. And then it will be more 20% that are some of these other broadly scientific areas. Because some of these areas are not obviously scientific, like habit formation or purpose or fatherhood and leadership, but there's a sense in which there is a science to those. And what I'm saying is that faith should integrate all aspects of life, and I want to be able to still show that. But I think that those other topics should probably be 20% of the overall episodes, and that 80% should be more geared towards apologetics. And so that's the direction I'm planning on going into. So to give you a sense of the kinds of comments that have been made, I want to read you some of them. And I want to tell you why I'm a little bit torn here. Because on the one hand, I don't necessarily want to reward, let's say, people who are disrespectful. But at the same time, I also want to acknowledge the comments that they're making. And I want to engage with these people who are, don't, in many cases, don't appear to be believers. And yet they are engaging with the things that we are talking about scientifically. So the first comments come from a few weeks back with Dr. Don DeYoung, and there's someone that said it's sad that religion can guide an otherwise intelligent man into believing in this nonsense, which was this is a very common kind of thing that gets said. The shorter comments are very to the point, and they're like, I don't want to say it's a knife that's cutting me or anything, but people are saying that I believe in nonsense, and essentially I'm an intelligent man, but how could I believe in this? This second comment here says, so we are deleting people's respectful comments that disagree with you now. I see, Jerry. How very dishonest of you. Whatever would Jesus say? Now, this comment was interesting to me because I didn't delete the person's comment that they were referring to. And so they thought I did, and that I was being somehow dishonest and not wanting to show that people disagree with me. But I haven't deleted any comments. I will delete them if there's profanity or something that's just highly disrespectful. But I don't mind a comment like this. But I have been called dishonest on multiple occasions now because of my understanding of the Bible and my application of it in areas that are scientific, because that's what, as a believer, I should be doing. Now, there's another comment on this video I want to go to, and it's going to be related to the one I'm going to talk more about. And it's from this person with the handle Paleo1019. And in this comment, I'll read it briefly, and then I'll go to the comment that I'm going to respond to in the next few moments. Paleo1019 says this to me. It's crazy to me that in 2024, you have people who till this day argue for a young Earth when it was already disproven before geology became a science. The thing about the early stages of science is that most people did believe in Noah's flood. It was religious clergymen that rejected it because they observed that certain geologic structures had to have taken more than a few thousand years. Figures like James Hutton, William Smith, and Charles Lyell. Don't claim to be pro science when you reject it because it doesn't line up with the Bible. Sorry, the earth is 4.5 billion years old. We have localized floods. We have nothing on a global scale. We know what large scale floods look like. Look at the Missoula floods that happened during the last ice age. Those did not create anything like we see at Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon is composed of limestones, shales, and sandstones with a mixture of volcanics. Rocks are reflections of their environment. That's Geology 101. You disagree with the entire field of geology means you are a science denier and you disagree with evidence-based science. Most Christians are not young earthers. Most accept evolution and the earth being billions of years old. This is not a debate anymore. It was settled in the early 1900s when radiometric dating became more popular. It makes zero sense to believe that all the scientists from around the world are all wrong because you think your interpretation of the Bible is right. Young earth creationism is a religious cult, and it is not necessary in Christianity. Stop pushing nonsense. It doesn't help Christians, it hurts them. You and this person misrepresent science and are outright being dishonest. All right, tell me how you really think. So what's so interesting about these ideas is that a person like Paleo 1019 has a very specific view, and anyone that disagrees is wrong. But then that's what he's saying that I do. But I haven't said that, I haven't said anything about him being dishonest. I haven't called a person that believes in evolution as being in a religious cult. I haven't called it nonsense. I haven't, because I disagree, right? And so the interesting thing is the very thing that I'm being accused of when I'm saying, hey, there's this evidence here that agrees with the biblical accounts. I'm being accused of being, what did he say? He said, I claim to be pro science, but I reject science when it doesn't, because it doesn't line up with the Bible. And then he says, if I disagree with geology, it means that I am a science denier. And what I'm saying is that there is geological evidence that points to a young earth, that points to a catastrophic global flood. And so it is precisely that kind of idea where I'm being told that I'm saying something like that I've never said, and that none of the people that I've had on have ever said. But then you're telling me things like I'm dishonest, that I'm misrepresenting science, and I'm pushing nonsense. But I'm being told that I'm being judgmental. But there's a great deal of judgmentalism, if that's a word, that's happening here. So I brought up that comment to give you a sense of the kinds of comments that are occurring here on these videos. And so the next thing I want to look at are two of my more recent comments from this past week that I'm going to respond to. One of them comes from Paleo 1019, and we'll get to it in a second. But first, well, I guess let's get to that one first, and then we'll look at this other comment from Star Tales. Okay, so the comment from Paleo 1019, again, we'll read it aloud for the people who are listening to the audio podcast only. He says this: even if the age of the earth were to change, it wouldn't be younger than 1 billion years. The oldest rocks on the crust of the earth is 4.1 billion years old. Check out the Acasta gneiss. Things change based on new discoveries. That's how science is supposed to be. You update yourself with the change. The age of the earth hasn't changed all that much. If it were, we adapt to the change. That's how science works. You all don't want to keep up with the change. You disregard the changes in science and still take the young earth position when science has demonstrated that the earth isn't young. What I mean by rocks are reflections of their environment is that sedimentary rocks are deposited in different environments: lakes, oceans, beaches, etc. We look at grain size and direction to determine what environment sediments were being deposited. You can't just make up a flood caused by all the sedimentary rocks we see today. That's not evidence. For the dinosaur bones, no, we do not crack open dinosaur bones and automatically find soft tissue. The soft tissue is found by putting the bones in an acid bath for months. What do you do when you find something like this? You say, oh, soft material can last for long periods of time, not dinosaurs lived recently and the earth is 6,000 years old. You are misrepresenting and misinterpreting science to make it fit a global flood and a young earth. If all of this was true, the entire scientific community would take it seriously. Science is not he said, she said situation. You have provided no evidence, just claims. Claims are not evidence. Okay. So there is a lot that I could respond to here, but I would rather just kind of, for the most part, respond to the final section there. The earlier stuff about the rocks being 4.1 billion, I honestly just don't take a great deal of stock in geology simply because it relies on assumptions that no one is willing to point out. So you're not telling me what your assumptions are to say 4.1 billion years because you can't know for sure that it's 4.1 billion years. There's no way to check your work. And so if there's no way to say, okay, this is how we know it's 4.1 because we have somebody that was 4.1 billion years ago and that's where the rock was, which is what you cannot do, then it's very difficult for me to even hear this because you actually have to have assumptions that you're making. And if I disagree with your assumptions that you make, it's not about the evidence or not, it's about what assumptions are you making behind the evidence. And so tell me what your assumptions are that you're making as you approach the evidence. And we can see a few of those when we get to the topic of the dinosaur bones in which soft tissue was found, because paleo admits there was soft tissue found in the bones. And that was unexpected because if dinosaur bones are millions of years old, or let's say hundreds of thousands. I don't know what the numbers are exactly, but they say some vast number. If they are that old, then we have an understanding of how soft tissue works. And what we do not find is soft tissue in something that would be millions or hundreds of thousands of years old. By this time, the soft tissue would have eroded, it would have dried up. And so, when you go into the dinosaur bone, whether you use an acid bath or not, they were not expecting soft tissue to be there, but there was soft tissue there. And so when you find it, what is your answer? Paleo's answer is, well, that must mean that soft material can last for long periods of time. And the question is, we have a very clear understanding of how long soft tissue can last. And you're saying that now we're going to completely change that view that we have a pretty good understanding of because you find that in there. If you want to do that, that is fine. That is one way to approach it. Your assumption is I would rather hold on to the old earth view than to hold on to the view of what we have an understanding of when it comes to soft tissue. And what I would argue is that we have a much better understanding of how soft tissue works than we do of how old something is. Because nobody's been around for 4.1 billion years or whatever the case may be. But we've been around long enough to know how long it takes for soft tissue to not be soft anymore. And so we have a very clear understanding of that. What you are saying is that we should completely change our understanding of the science of soft tissue, let's say, in bones, so that it accommodates that. That is an option that you have. That's an assumption that you can make. But what you're saying is that I am being unscientific by saying maybe we actually do understand how soft tissue works, and that maybe those dinosaur bones are not as old as you think. And it's going to depend on what assumptions we bring to it. So I'm being told that I'm misrepresenting and misinterpreting science. Those things that we have talked about are science. I haven't heard any response to the carbon 14. I'd be interested to hear what Paleo 1019 thinks about the fact that carbon 14 exists in every tested sample that the rate team and others that Dr. DeYoung mentioned brought to the labs. The lab said, "Hey, this is coal or this is diamond. There's no carbon 14 in this because those things are very, very old." And then there was carbon 14 in them. So which one is it? Is it that the coal and the diamond is as old as you say? Or if we look at the fact that there's carbon 14 there, maybe we do have a pretty good understanding of how carbon 14 works, and that maybe it's that the coal and the diamond isn't as old as you think. And as Dr. DeYoung pointed out, that if you go back and you use the carbon 14 as a way to somehow try to date how far back those things go, they go back roughly 4 to 5,000 years, which would actually line up with the timing of which when God said that there was a global flood on the earth. And so this is what we're saying. There is evidence here, and you're saying, well, this is just claims. There's no evidence. It is evidence. The issue is you don't like it. You don't like the conclusion. And that's fine to not like the conclusion, but it is evidence. And so, one other thing I'd like to point out, or two other things. One is, if all of this was true, the entire scientific community would take it seriously. It's very difficult to see, if you're a person of science at all, how you would actually believe that. Now, I'm somebody that has written research papers, who read research papers. I'm in science. The idea that the entire scientific community would take something seriously is just not the case. It is not a monolith. And so there are plenty of people that have contrarian views about various things in science. And then sometimes it takes us years and years to find out that those contrarians were actually correct. So this idea that if all of what we're saying is true, everyone would take it seriously is just not true, because there is more to it than just simply looking at the evidence. You have to have a worldview that's willing to accept it. And often people are not willing to accept it. We're willing to consider the idea that there might be a God, but there are plenty of people who are not. And I would ask Paleo 1019, do you believe that it's possible? Are you willing to concede that possibility that there is a God? Are you willing to concede the God hypothesis and then say, okay, if the God hypothesis is possible, what are the kinds of evidence that I would need to see? Or are you completely taking that off the table? If you are, then that reveals a bias. The second thing here at the end is that in the comment, he says, science is not he said, she said situation. That's absolutely false. That's all science is, he said and she said, right? All science is are people giving their hypotheses and points of view, and we put them up in front of everyone and we say, hey, like what do we do with this evidence? I think it's this, you think it's that. And so that's what this entire discussion is about. That's what science is all about. To say that it's not he said, she said is just not true. And so it is he said, she said. It is let's put my hypothesis up against your hypothesis. Let's look at the evidence. Let's see if the assumptions that we are making are reasonable. And based on that, let's see what we are going to go with. What I would argue is that many of the atheistic and materialistic and naturalistic explanations that scientists give, it's really telling you that they are atheists and they are naturalists. And that's fine, but that's not the same as saying it's scientific. And so they're willing to go along with explanations that go along with an atheistic worldview. And what I'm saying is that believers have a different worldview. So we're bringing a different set of assumptions to the table. And often the atheist does not allow for the possibility of a theistic explanation. So if you don't allow for the possibility, then you will not even be able to see the evidence that we're presenting, because you will immediately dismiss it and you'll say it's not evidence, it's just claims. So I'm saying at least take a look at the evidence. So what do you say about the carbon 14 stuff? How do you now completely throw out everything that we understood about soft tissue because it doesn't fit with the old earth? That's what it sounds like to me. And so that's what I would ask Paleo 1019. Okay, so here's the other comment from Star Tales from 3 days ago. Now, what to give a little bit of context here, I took a snippet out of the interview with Dr. Don DeYoung, where he gave the four major tenets of what he calls young Earth creationism. Now, again, I don't like that term, and I don't think he much likes it either, but it gives a good sense of what we're talking about. I would just prefer to say biblical creationism, that we believe in what the scriptures say about how God created the heavens and the earth. And so But because there are people that say they believe in creation, that believe in an ancient Earth, then to differentiate between those views, sometimes it's called young Earth creationism. Here are the 4 tenets that Dr. Don gave. Number 1, Genesis chapters 1 and 2 are literal narrative history. It's pretty self-explanatory. It's not poetic. It's not some kind of allegory or metaphor, what we read in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. It is a historical account of what God did in the beginning to create the world. Number 2, Adam and Eve were fully human people. So they were not some kind of precursor to mankind. They were not hominids or some kind of Neanderthal type creature. They were fully human people created by God. Number 3, biological change occurs, but it is limited. So this is referring to evolution. Nobody disputes that evolution occurs. What we dispute is how limited is it? Now, in our experience, evolution is limited. A piece of corn is planted and it creates a corn stalk, which has more corn in it. You don't plant a piece of corn and it comes up a beanstalk. That's not how it works. But according to macroevolution, that is how things would work, that there could be something that would be completely different developing over time. But that's not what we observe. So we are saying that biological change occurs. We see that in life, but it is limited. Third or fourth is that the Genesis flood, or the global flood described in the book of Genesis in the early chapters, is the greatest catastrophe that the world has experienced. And this gets back to what Paleo was talking about. When we talk about a global flood and the evidence of it around the world, the idea that that because there are sedimentary rocks that negates the idea of a global flood, I'm not exactly sure where he's coming from with that, but the global flood has a lot to do with what we find in geology. And if you do not acknowledge the existence of a global flood, then it completely changes your assumptions about what you are finding, for example, in the Grand Canyon. And so when you find things like polystrate fossils, it really doesn't make sense from a perspective of that just gradual small layers built up over time. And that's what we see in the world. So when you see polystrate fossils with these different strata and a tree, let's say a fossilized tree that cuts through all of those different strata of the rock, how do you explain that from this gradual geological worldview? But when you think of things as catastrophic in terms of the flood, it makes perfect sense that a flood could completely bury a tree with various layers of sediment and create the polystrate fossils that we currently see. So I'd be interested to hear, how do you explain polystrate fossils? Okay, so those are the 4 major tenets of young Earth creationism that Dr. Don gave 2 weeks ago. And so here is the response to that from Star Tales, the actual 4 tenets, because apparently what Dr. Don gave wasn't the real 4 tenets. I just gave them to you. Genesis 1 and 2 are literal narrative history. Adam and Eve were fully human people. Biological change occurs, but it is limited. And the Genesis flood is the greatest catastrophe that the world has experienced. Star Tales says that these are the actual 4 tenets. Number 1, our theology is 100% correct and can never be mistaken. 2, questioning our theology is questioning the Bible. 3, never be open to changing one's theology, for that apostatizes your faith. 4, all those who disagree with us are heretics and can be ignored or ostracized. Now, what's so funny to me about this is that this really seems to be the perspective of atheistic materialists. To say that young Earth creationists are ignoring and ostracizing people, I'm sure that that is possible, but if we are the minority, as others have said in some of the comments, if it is true that this is a minority position, how are we ostracizing people? We're the minority position. How are we ostracizing? If anyone is ostracizing, it is the majority position. If anyone is ignoring people, it is the majority position. If there's anyone that's saying that people are heretics to science, right? You can look at Paleo's comment. He's essentially calling me a heretic. He's calling me someone that should be ignored and ostracized. That's coming from that side. I'm not ignoring or ostracizing anyone. I'm not calling anyone a heretic. So the other points that he makes again is this is the idea that actually what's happening is that we are saying that we are right and that there's nothing that we can say that can be wrong, and that if anyone questions what we believe, then they are questioning the Bible, and they are apostatizing from the faith. Now, we didn't say anything of the kind. And so that's all I would say to that, that this idea that we are being dishonest, that I am being dishonest, that what I really believe is this, all I can do is tell you what I believe. And if you're going to then doubt me, then there's really not anything else I can say to you that will convince you anyway. And so I would be interested to hear some evidence that you would give. Paleo gives a little bit, but doesn't address the evidence given by Dr. Don, except to say, well, when you find that soft tissue in the bones, that just means that soft tissue can last longer than we thought. Well, you're talking about soft tissue lasting orders of magnitude longer than we thought. And so now you're going to completely change what we had a pretty good understanding of from the science, because it doesn't fit with the ancient earth or the ancient universe. You can do that if you like, but I choose not to. So those are those two comments. So that's enough of that. You can see how for me this is a little bit difficult. I don't want to be called dishonest, or someone who calls people a heretic, or someone who is ostracizing others. There's a tone and a negativity in some of the comments that I was not expecting when I started this podcast. And so I'm trying to develop a tougher skin, let's say, and not try to just fight back against people, except to just show the evidence that we're talking about here. And so I don't want to clap back with some kind of uh, unchristian or ungodly responses, but instead to show people the love of Christ and show them that there is truth behind what we're saying, and that it's not simply that we are blindly following that. We're showing you evidence. So please address the evidence. Paleo, I'd like to see you address the carbon 14 evidence. I'd like you to admit at least that, hey, that soft tissue is not something that's something that's a problem. If you can't at least admit that's something to think about, then that's the part where it's difficult for me to be able to engage, because are we both approaching this in good faith? I don't know. All right. So I'd like to go next to what I'm excited about right now, and that is my new book, I Walk, Therefore I Am: How Walking on Two Legs Proves that God Exists. So I'm going to talk a little bit after I give a summary of the book about how you can get access to the book if you're wanting to buy it. If you are an atheist, or you're someone who does not believe in the existence of God, this book is about that. If you would be interested in reading the book, but you don't want to pay for it, then I'll tell you how you can email me, and I will send you a free ebook uh, of this. And I'd be interested to know what you think. So I'll let you know more about that in a second. But this book is called I Walk, Therefore I Am: How Walking on Two Legs Proves that God Exists. I'm really pleased with how it's turned out. And so let's go ahead and go to part one of the book. Part one is really the heart of the book, chapters 2, 3, and 4. I call part one, Humans Were Made for Walking on Two Legs. And so chapter 2 is entitled Walking on Two Legs is Really Hard to Do. Chapter 3 is Walking on Two Legs is Not the Product of Evolution. Chapter 4 is Walking on Two Legs Has Been Designed. And so I want to talk a little bit about those three chapters, and then I'll tell you how you can get access to the book. Okay, so walking on two legs is really hard to do. In this chapter, I talk about the fact that balancing on two legs is an inherently unstable position. So if you think about a two-legged stool, well, they don't really build two-legged stools. You will have a three-legged tripod, let's say, or a four-legged stool. And the reason why you have those configurations is because they are stable. you need at least 3 points of contact with the ground. I'm speaking from a mechanical engineering perspective here. You need at least 3 contacts with the ground to be stable. It's why kids learn to ride a tricycle rather than going straight to a bike. Or even if they did have a bike, you put 2 training wheels on there, and now you have four, or really, when you go side to side, it's 3 points of contact with the ground rather than just two. Because if you just simply try to stand a bicycle up, it's going to fall over without a kickstand to provide that third point of contact. So, when we're talking about the evolutionary story of going from a quadrupedal ape to a bipedal human, going from 4 limbs to 2 legs, the issue with it is that you're going from a stable configuration on 4 to an unstable configuration on 2. And if that is to happen, then we have to admit that that is a very difficult behavior to do, balancing and walking on 2 legs. Now, we do it effortlessly, we do it very effectively and efficiently, but it doesn't negate the fact that it is hard to do from an engineering and from a dynamics perspective. And so in this chapter, I talk about that. And then I talk about the 2 ways that we are able to do it so well. And it is our bodies and our nervous systems. So our bodies are specially designed. I'll go ahead and start using the word now because it is true. We are specially fitted, engineered, designed to be on 2 legs. And so when you look at the way our feet are and our ankles and our legs, we are able to stand and balance and walk on 2 legs because of the way our bodies are built. Now, not only do we have the bodies for it, but you would also have to have the control system that can also do that can control that body in such a way to do the things that we do. So we have both of those things. And so the question becomes, what is the best explanation for how we have these engineered bodies for this unstable configuration of being on 2 legs? Because it doesn't just randomly happen. That's not how such a thing can occur. I know this from experience. My doctoral research was in designing artificial intelligence controllers for balance and stability in bipedal humanoid robots. So my work was literally in taking a humanoid robot in simulation, and I also had a physical one too, but in simulation mostly, and try to learn how to control it so that it would stay upright. Well, it falls down so easily because it's an unstable configuration. How do we do it as humans? To say that that happens, if it to bring up something other, some kind of random reason for that, just doesn't line up with how things work. I didn't come up with random controllers. I had to make sure I designed things so that the humanoid robot could stay upright. So that brings us to chapter 2, because there are 2 prevailing explanations for how you can have a human on 2 legs as efficient and effective at walking as we are. The first is evolution, and the second is intelligent design. Now, there are some people that say, well, you can kind of mix the two, but I would say in general, people that believe in evolution do not believe in design in general. There are some that try to mix the two, but I think you can pretty much say that there are 2 camps here. There's evolution and there's intelligent design. So chapter 3 of my book is walking on 2 legs is not the product of evolution. It is the most controversial chapter in the book, I'm sure. And so I'm saying something that is a pretty bold statement, but I think it's pretty straightforward why that is the case. Now, what I do in this chapter is I point out that there is a what, a why, and a how of evolution that need to be true in order for evolution to be true. So I want to say this very carefully so that those who are listening who believe in evolution, you would be able to try to answer these things. Let's begin with the what. The what is what happened. What happened, according to the evolutionary story, there was a quadrupedal ape. It turned over time into a bipedal human. What happened? Well, the way we would determine what happened is we would look at the fossil record. And when we look at the fossil record, what we should see, if macroevolution is true, is we should see an abundance of transitional forms going from a quadrupedal ape to a bipedal human. I want to be clear here. There should be an abundance of transitional forms. So I don't want to hear about a handful of transitional forms. The fossil record should show an abundance of transitional forms. We now have billions of people on the earth. And so if these billions of people on the earth over time came from quadrupedal apes, the number of changes that would have taken place from the quadrupedal ape to the bipedal human, according to the evolutionary story, would have produced thousands of transitional forms. So I'm not asking for thousands. I'm asking for dozens, maybe hundreds, because that's what should have happened to, it would have been necessary to happen that way to produce a bipedal human from quadrupedal apes. By anyone's estimation, there is not an abundance of transitional forms between quadrupedal apes and bipedal humans. There's not an abundance. There is not. And so, why is that? And how do we explain the, the fact that that is not the case if macroevolution happened as the story goes? Now, you might be saying to me, well, what about the the progression that they show with the quadrupedal ape to the bipedal human? I'm telling you that that is a depiction and that that is not reflective of the fossil record. And that generally they will add something in there that looks like a bipedal ape, where it's kind of hunched over, but it's on two legs. That thing is not in the fossil record. We have quadrupeds in the fossil record and in modern times. We have bipedal humans in the fossil record and in modern times. We do not have that bipedal ape thing in the fossil record. And of course, it's not in modern times either. And so what I'm saying is that it didn't exist, that people believe it did, but they haven't found it. And you can say, well, we found this or that. Again, you need an abundance of them. So to find something that you say is that, to find one thing or two things or a handful of things that you say is that, is not the same as an abundance of them. You need to find an abundance of them because you're saying that that is how this happened. So we should see evidence of it, of what happened. We don't have the evidence. The second thing is the why of evolution. And I'll just talk about this briefly. But the why of evolution is, why would this have happened? Why would there have been a transition from a quadrupedal ape to a bipedal human? Why? Now, when we're answering this question, here's what would need to happen for evolution to be true. There would need to be a series of evolutionary or selective pressures that would have forced a quadrupedal ape to make the changes that are necessary. It has to be pushed that way. There has to be environmental pressures that force it to change, or else it is not as well suited for the environment and it dies. But that's not what we're not given a series of selective pressures. We're not given a series of environmental or evolutionary pressures that would have done this. What happens is people give a reason. Richard Dawkins has famously given the reason of it was fashionable to be on two legs instead of four. That's his reason. That's not a series of reasons, because that's what you need, a series of pressures that would have induced the hundreds, if not thousands, of adaptations that would be necessary to go from a quadrupedal ape to a bipedal human. Where's the series? No one offers one. But you have to have that if evolution happened. No one offers one. They just say, hey, just don't worry about it. but I'm looking at your evidence. What is your evidence for this? And it's not there as we look into the details. The third thing is the how of evolution. How did this happen? Let's assume for a moment that we can ignore the fact that it's not in the fossil record. Let's assume that we can ignore the fact that no one offers a series of selective pressures that would have caused this. How would such a thing have happened? The neo-Darwinian view is that genetic mutations over time created new traits that were selected by nature, so natural selection, to cause these changes over time. So the mechanism is genetic mutations and natural selection. Now, you might not be familiar with what genetic mutations are, but they are corruptions in genetic code that these people are saying that these corruptions of code caused the formation of new body parts and nervous systems that created bipedal walking in balance rather than quadrupedal walking in balance. Now, I'm not going to use terms like nonsense. I'm not going to use terms like being dishonest, like the terms that are used for me. But I would say that's a highly questionable idea that sounds a lot like science fiction. If you look at something like the X-Men or some of these Marvel movies, where mutated people have these superpowers, that is precisely what this sounds like when people say that mutations have led to these problems. So let me give you three reasons why I think that mechanism just fails completely. Number one, mutations are almost always harmful rather than helpful. And so because they're harmful, there's this thing called genetic entropy where mutations are beginning to accumulate over time and make humans and which can cause disease and various issues and illnesses in humans. So the idea that accumulating mutations actually makes things better is not what the evidence says scientifically. So the idea that mutations would bring about these changes, but mutations are harmful. The second thing is that the idea that genetic mutations would actually produce new genetic information just doesn't make sense, because corruption of code doesn't produce more and better code. It just corrupts the code that you have. Now, I know this from I write code. Working with robotics, I have to write code. You don't get good code by corrupting existing code, and you don't get new code by corrupting existing code. What ends up happening is none of the code works. And so similarly, the idea that mutations over time would result in new genetic code that would produce these different structures bodily and different differences in the nervous systems of these organisms turning into humans just doesn't line up with what we see in science. And then finally, epigenetics uh, is a term that refers to non-genetic factors that figure into new bodies and the kinds of things that would need to have happened. And so those non-genetic factors are not figured in at all when you think about the neo-Darwinian synthesis. So for that reason, the mechanism given, the how of evolution, fails. So we don't have a what that makes sense, or we don't have a what that we see in the fossil record. We are not given a why that would make any kind of sense as in terms of why this would have happened. And then we are not given a how that is scientific. And so in the Dr. Bo episode, when he said that evolution is not scientific at all, that's what we're getting at. That this idea of genetic mutations with natural selection is an idea that even atheistic scientists today are increasingly saying that's not a mechanism at all. That's just something maybe that people in the past wanted to be true, but that's not a mechanism. And so we need to come up with something else. And again, they don't want it to be intelligent design, of course, but they can at least say, they can be honest enough to say that that's not the answer. We believe it's another answer, and we don't believe it's intelligent design. But we can no longer co-sign that idea because it's not science. So that's what I talk about in chapter 3. Chapter 4 is walking on two legs has been designed. And so basically, I appeal to the design inference, which is a very old idea. The idea is that if you see something that has been designed, then there must have been a designer. If you see something that is made for a purpose, and when we look at the human body, it is made to walk on two legs. It is engineered to do so. We are hardwired to do so. You may have noticed, if you're an atheist, that you have used these kinds of terms. We're hardwired to do this. You're right. We are hardwired to do this. Now, when I say that, you say, well, no, I don't mean that we've been designed. Well, in my experience, when you hardwire something, it is because someone does that deliberately. And so you're right. We are hardwired to do certain things. We are made or engineered or designed to do certain things. But that means that if that is true, then there must also be a designer. And I spend the rest of the book talking about that. And so really excited about the book. Let me show you really quickly how you can get access to the book if you want it. If you go to jerryleephd.com. So jerryleephd.com. It'll go to my beacons page. It's like a link in bio type page. So you can, it shows up really well on your mobile devices as well. And if you want a copy of the book, you can go down to my products here. I walk therefore I am. You can click there and you can get a copy of the ebook. I also give you an audiobook that you can get off of SoundCloud. I believe you should be able to download it off of SoundCloud so you can hear me reading it. If that's something you would prefer, you might not want to hear my voice at all, and that's fine. But you get that as a bonus with the book. So that's how you can get access to my book. If you're wanting to contact me, there are a couple of ways you can do that. So let's say you're an atheist and you're saying, "Hey, I'm not going to pay $27 for your book, but I'll read it if you give it to me." Then, if you will contact me, if you look here on the link in bio page, under my picture, it says my name, Jerry Swafford Jr., faith-based education, robotics and AI, and entrepreneurship. And there's a little envelope, then there's the YouTube symbol, and then there's the Facebook symbol. If you click on the first one, that will bring up an email client, whatever you have on your computer, and it will link you to my email. And you can send me an email and you say, "Hey, I listened to your podcast or I heard about your book and you said you would give it to me for free if I wanted a copy to read. I'll email you a link and you can get the book for free if you don't want to pay for it." So the other way you can get in contact with me is you can click on my website. It's the first link under those three links, Jerry Swafford Jr., and you click on that and go down to the bottom of the page where it says contact me. It has my email there. I'll spell it out for you. My email address is jerry at jerrysweafford.com. Jerry at jerryswafford.com. You can email me there and I'll and tell me, "Hey, I don't really want to pay for the book, but I'd like to read it," and I'll send you a copy of the book. Next month, I'm going to have like paperback copies of the book, and that'll be cool. And I won't be in a position to just hand those out, but the ebook copies, I can do that right now. So that's the book. That's what I'm excited about right now. Okay, so we're going to bring this to a close, and we're going to come to the final 4 questions of the podcast. Now, usually I will ask my guests these final 4 questions, but today I'm the guest, so I'm going to answer the final 4 questions. So the first question I usually ask my guests is there a book? So I'm a book guy. I like reading. And is there a book that you like that you have been recommending to people lately? And so the book that I would recommend to you, because we've been talking about apologetics, and that is a direction that we're going to be going into more in the coming episodes. The book I would recommend is called Convicted. This is the book right here, Convicted: A Scientist Examines the Evidence for Christianity by Dr. Brad Harrab. That book is just a really good resource. I've gone back to it repeatedly. It talks a little bit about things like the polystrate fossils, for instance, and some of those evidences of a young Earth and a catastrophic global flood. And so, again, I would urge, as I talk more about these things in the content and in later episodes, I'm sure I'll be pulling from some of the work that Dr. Brad Harrab refers to in that book. But when I think about apologetics, it's those 3 areas that I think we discussed before. It's kind of, I'm not exactly sure what I've said in this podcast and what I said in the version that didn't get recorded earlier. So you'll have to forgive me if I didn't say this before. But when I think of apologetics, I think of 3 ideas. They are the existence of God, the inspiration of the Bible, and the deity of Jesus Christ. And so Harab's book goes into those 3 areas and to various issues related to those 3 areas. So it's very good. And again, those are 3 areas that we are going to be, particularly the first 2 are going to be things that we talk more about on this podcast. And again, I would even say particularly the existence of God. I think that's where a lot of the science can point us to the fact that God exists. And I think there's some things in the scriptures that tell us, hey, the heavens declare the glory of God and the firmament shows his handiwork. Romans chapter 1 says that people will be without excuse if they don't believe because his invisible attributes are clearly seen. I think we can see that there is a creator, that there is a designer when we look at the world and we look at science, how things are, show us that there is a God. So that would be the book that I would recommend, Convicted by Dr. Brad Harrop. The second question that I usually ask is about a quote or a scripture. And so I don't have specifically a single quote or a scripture, but I have been reading Dr. Bo Kirkwood's A Purpose-Driven God. He was on the podcast before. I talked about him, a couple times today. But he sent me a copy of his book, and I've just started it this past week. But there's something he talks about in the introduction to his book that I've been thinking a lot about lately, and it's the difference between the how questions that science is able to answer and the why questions that faith or belief or specifically the Bible or the scriptures are able to answer, and how sometimes people get those two mixed up and they think that science can answer some of the why questions or that science can dismiss the questions of why or purpose. So I want to read a quick paragraph out of the book to kind of show this, and at the end there's a quote from John Lennox that I have been thinking some about. So it goes like this in chapter 1. Well, I guess it's the introduction to A Purpose-Driven God by Dr. Bo Kirkwood. John Lennox, eminent Irish mathematician and Christian apologist, likens the why question to a cake made by Aunt Matilda. With apologies to Dr. Lennox, I'm going to change his story slightly for my readers and call it Aunt Margaret's peach cobbler, myself being a Texan. Aunt Margaret makes a peach cobbler for Cousin Jimmy's birthday. Without knowing this, we asked nutritional scientists, as well as biochemists, physicists, and mathematicians, to tell us why Aunt Margaret made a peach cobbler. I would argue that without asking Aunt Margaret, it is impossible for them to know the answer to this question. They can analyze the cobbler from a scientific point of view, discover its ingredients, and make a number of deductions, such as the fact that the cobbler has sugar, flour, peaches, etc., but they will never come to the answer of why on their own. Similarly, we might ask a scientist why the water is boiling. He or she can describe the thermokinetics of how increased temperature causes the water molecules to become agitated and boil, but the answer might have been simply to boil an egg. This does not mean why questions are unimportant. Quote, "It is one thing to suggest that science cannot answer questions of ultimate purpose. It is quite another to dismiss purpose as an illusion because science cannot deal with it," unquote, writes Lennox. So this comes from John Lennox's book. What he says there is that it would be one thing for people to say, well, science can't answer purpose questions or the why questions. But what people often do is they go the next step, which is to say that those questions are just illusions. Purpose is an illusion. Design is an illusion. You just think the human body looks designed. It's not actually designed. It just looks that way. But I don't think so. And if you have that assumption that it's just that way, then again, we are going to come to different conclusions based on the evidence. And what I would say to you is, why is it that you will not accept the possibility of design or the possibility of purpose? These questions that rise up in us so naturally. So again, one of the things I would say about all of these questions that we've been talking about today is that we really want to do a better job of really teasing out what our assumptions are when we're approaching the evidence and not vilifying someone. I'm not telling you not to get on to me because you all don't seem to have a problem with that. But I am saying that to call me dishonest because I have different assumptions than you is you're missing the point. I have different assumptions. It's not about being dishonest. You're assuming that I think the same way you do and that I'm just lying and saying something different. And I'm not sure why I would do this, but I'm sure you have your reasons for thinking I'm dishonest. Okay. So the third thing I generally am asking my guest is what is what is an unconventional belief that you have? What is something that you believe that most other people don't? And I would go back to what we've been talking about today. Much of today's discussion has been about the early chapters of Genesis And I would say that it is not a popular position as a man of science, as someone with a PhD in mechanical engineering, someone as a robotics engineer. It is not a popular view to believe that there is a designer of the human body. That's not popular to say there's a designer of the human body and this is evidence of God. And so I would assume that people are going to be very upset about chapter 3 of my book. That's an unconventional view to say that walking on two legs is not the product of evolution, and to say that definitively. So that is something I believe that is an unconventional truth, I would say. The fourth question I usually ask my guests is, what is a piece of wisdom that you would leave behind for your children or for your family? And so I don't have children yet, not married yet, but with God's blessing, that is something that will happen in the coming years. That I'll get married and have children. And the thing I would leave behind for them, the thing I would want to instill in them is a desire to use and a habit, I would say, of using the scriptures in all of life. And we talked about this at the very outset of the podcast, but the idea of faith being foundational to everything. I think the Bible, I believe the scriptures are foundational to everything, and that we can apply the Bible to the way we have fun, the way we go to school, the way we interact with mankind, the way we answer YouTube comments, the way we conduct a podcast interview. And so all of the things that we come across in life are things that we can apply the scriptures to. And so if there was a piece of wisdom that I would leave behind for them, it is that we should apply the Bible to everything and have the Bible be foundational in our lives. And if I could leave that with my family, with my children, that is a piece of wisdom that I would really want to leave behind for them. It made me think of the passage that says, uh, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding, in all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will direct your paths." So that direction comes from the Word of God, and so I would want to leave that idea with them. Okay, so that's the solo podcast taped for the second time. I think this one was much smoother. I think you would much rather have heard this one that you've heard today than the previous version that I just gave you. So, or that I didn't record because my mic wasn't on. The mic is on now, so you will get this version of the podcast. So, what again, just to recap, the plan is now to be interviewing more people along the lines of apologetics. So instead of that being maybe 20% of the podcast episodes, as was happening the first 10 episodes, I think moving forward, you'll see that number be closer to 80% or more. So if that is something that you just say, no, I like the way it was before, please let me know. Text me, email me, put a comment on the page, or again, if you're on the podcast, I haven't really checked podcast comments, but if you can comment there, I should eventually get access to it. So we're going to be going more along the lines of apologetics, and I think that'll be something that will be helpful to people. So that's the solo episode. I hope this has been something that's been helpful to you. It gives you a sense of where I am with the podcast right now and where I plan to go moving forward. Until next time, keep asking questions and keep the faith. Thank you.